My wife stood up in that courtroom on a Tuesday morning in Spokane and told the judge she wanted the house, primary custody of all 3 kids, and $3,200 a month in support. And I looked the judge dead in the eye and said, "That's fine. Give her everything." The gallery went quiet the way a room goes quiet when everybody decides at the same second that they've just watched a man throw his own life in the trash. My mother made a sound behind me, a small wet sound she tried to swallow. My attorney's pen stopped moving. And my wife, the woman I'd been married to for 22 years, sat there with her hands folded and let a little smile settle onto her mouth, the kind you try to hide out of politeness and can't quite manage. She thought she'd won. She had no idea what was already sitting in a manila folder in my lawyer's briefcase, 2 feet away from her. "I'm glad you're here with me." This one took me a long time to be able to say out loud. So wherever you're watching from, do me a favor and drop the name of your town in the comments. I like knowing how far this story travels. Now let me tell you how a quiet man ended up on his knees in gratitude while his wife ended up on hers on a public sidewalk. Let me back up. My name's Wallace Merrick, I'm 58 years old, and for 31 of those years I built bridges. Not the metaphor, actual bridges, overpasses, river crossings, the kind of steel and concrete work that pays well and keeps a man away from home for months at a stretch. That was the deal I made with my life early on. My father drove a delivery truck and my mother cleaned other people's houses, and there was never quite enough. And I swore my kids would never lie awake at night listening to their parents argue about a heating bill. So I chased the work. Idaho, then North Dakota during the oil years, then 2 long contracts up in Alaska where the daylight does strange things to a man in December. I met my wife at a wedding in 1999. I'll call her by what she was to me, my wife, because after everything, I find I don't much like saying her name anymore. She was bright and quick, and she laughed at things before other people understood they were funny, and I fell for her the way you fall down a set of stairs, all at once and without any dignity. We got married 11 months later in her mother's backyard in Coeur d'Alene, folding chairs and a rented tent, and my mother crying in the front row the same way she'd cry 22 years later, except for opposite reasons. We had 3 kids. My oldest, my son, is 16 now. My middle, my daughter, is 13. And my youngest, my little girl, is 9. I want you to hold on to those ages, because they matter later in a way I never could have imagined. For most of our marriage, I told myself the distance was a small price. I'd come home from a job with a beard I'd forgotten I was growing, and my son would run at me across the driveway, and my wife would stand in the doorway with her arms crossed and this look on her face, and I read that look as missing me. That's the thing about being gone all the time. You fill in the parts you can't see with whatever story keeps you warm on a cot in a job trailer at 2 in the morning. I told myself a good story for a lot of years. The first time I felt the floor shift was at my son's 14th birthday. I'd flown back from a bridge job near Lewiston to be there, and I was flipping burgers in the backyard, half listening to the neighbor talk about his boat, when I looked over at my son laughing with his friends, and I had the strangest feeling, like looking at a photograph of somebody you know you should recognize and can't. He didn't look like me. He didn't look like my father, or my brother, or any Merrick that had ever stood at a grill. And I remember catching my wife watching me watch him, and there was something in her face that wasn't tenderness. It was closer to fear. I let it go. You do that. You have a beer and you tell yourself you're tired and you've been staring at rebar for 6 weeks and your eyes are playing tricks. But it didn't let me go. Over the next year, I started paying attention to things I'd trained myself not to see. The credit card statement with a charge from a hotel in Missoula on a weekend I'd been told she was visiting her sister in Portland. The way she'd taken up spin class 3 evenings a week and come home flushed but not sweaty. The phone she'd started carrying face down and taking into the bathroom. Little things. Splinters. Each one small enough to ignore on its own and together enough to bleed you dry. The night that broke it open was an ordinary one. I'd come home a week early from a job in Boise because the concrete pour got pushed by a permitting problem, and I didn't call ahead because I wanted to surprise the kids. I pulled into the driveway around 9, and the house was dark except for the porch light, and there was a truck I didn't recognize parked across the street. A white contractor's pickup with a ladder rack and a magnetic sign on the door I couldn't read in the dark. I sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes like a stranger casing the place, and then the front door opened and a man stepped out. He didn't hurry. He wasn't sneaking. He walked down my front steps like a man who'd walked down them 100 times, and my wife stood in the doorway in her robe and touched his arm before he left. I didn't confront her. I've thought about that a lot since. Why I didn't just get out of the car and end it right there on the lawn. But I've built things my whole life, and you learn one thing above all in that trade. You don't tear down a structure until you understand exactly how it's holding itself up. If you swing the wrecking ball blind, it comes down on your own head. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I got out of the car, I walked inside, I kissed my wife on the cheek, and I said the drive wore me out and I was going to bed. And then I lay in the dark next to her for 6 hours, listening to her breathe, and I started to plan. The next Monday I found a private investigator. I'll call him what he called himself, a domestic investigator, which is a polite way to say he finds out whether people's spouses are lying to them, And he found out that mine was, with a thoroughness that made me sick. His name was Ford. Dwayne Ford, a retired sheriff's deputy out of Kootenai County with a gray mustache and the calm, unhurried manner of a man who's seen every kind of human wreckage there is and stopped being surprised by any of it. He didn't judge me and he didn't pity me, and I've never been so grateful for anything. "Give me 60 days, Ford said, and I'll give you the truth. But I've got to warn you, Mr. Merrick. Most people who sit in that chair say they want the truth. What they actually want is for me to prove it was all a misunderstanding. If that's what you're after, save your money." I told him I wanted the truth even if it took my arm off. It nearly did. The white truck belonged to a man named Reed Vance. He owned a mid-sized commercial construction outfit out of Spokane Valley. The kind that does tenant improvements, restaurant build-outs, that sort of thing. And here's the part that took the wind clean out of me. He and my wife hadn't started their affair last year, or 2 years ago. Ford pulled together receipts, a couple of old emails a mutual contact forwarded, a pattern of hotel stays that lined up against my work travel like two halves of the same map. It went back to 2007. My son was born in 2008. I sat in Ford's little office over a payday loan storefront, and I looked at that timeline and I did the arithmetic that no father should ever have to do, and the whole architecture of my life started to groan under its own weight. I thought about every job I'd taken, every extra contract in North Dakota, every winter in Alaska. I'd told myself I was doing it for my family. I'd been paying month after month, year after year to be gone, so that the man in the white truck could be home. "I need to know something for certain before I do anything else," I told Ford. My voice didn't sound like mine. "I need to know whose kids they are." He nodded like he'd been expecting it. He gave me the name of a lab in Seattle that did legally admissible paternity testing, and he explained gently that if I ever wanted the results to hold up in court, I couldn't just pull hairs off a brush in a bathroom. It had to be done right, chain of custody, cheek swabs, the whole procedure documented. But he also told me that a lot of men in my shoes did an informal test first, at home, just to know, just to be able to breathe again, and then did the formal one later if the informal one confirmed what they were afraid of. I couldn't wait months to breathe, so I did the informal one first. I'll spare you the mechanics of collecting DNA from your own children without them knowing. It's a grim little errand, and I'm not proud of it. What I'll tell you is that 3 weeks later I was standing in a grocery store parking lot with my phone pressed to my ear, and a woman from the testing service was reading me numbers, and the world I'd built came down all at once. My son, not mine, 0% probability of paternity. My middle daughter, not mine either. And then she got to my youngest, my 9-year-old, the one who'd always looked the least like me, the one I'd secretly wondered about the hardest during those dark 2 a.m. sessions of doubt, and she said the probability of paternity was 99%. I want you to sit with the cruelty of that for a second, because it took me weeks to understand it. The 2 children I had never once doubted, the son who ran at me across the driveway, the daughter who called me at every job site just to tell me about her day, they weren't mine by blood. And the one child I'd let myself suspect in my weakest and worst moments out of nothing but the shape of her face, she was the only one who was. I got the formal court-admissible test done the following month, same results. Chain of custody clean, signed by a Dr. Sorensen, notarized, the whole thing bulletproof. I put those 3 sheets of paper in a manila folder, and I put the folder in a fireproof safe in a storage unit my wife didn't know I rented, and for a little while I just functioned. I went to work, I came home, I coached my youngest soccer team on the 2 weekends I was in town. I looked at my son across the dinner table, and I loved him so much it felt like a broken rib every time I breathed, and I could not, for the life of me, figure out what a person was supposed to do with a thing like this. Then, on a Sunday in March, my wife asked me to sit down at the kitchen table, slid a folder of her own across the wood, and told me she wanted a divorce. I almost laughed. I'd been carrying the truth for 4 months, and she thought she was the one holding the loaded gun. She had it all worked out. She wanted the house, our house, the one I'd put $110,000 of my own overtime into. She wanted primary physical custody of the children, with me relegated to every other weekend. She wanted child support calculated on my income, which, because I'm the one who chased the money for 2 decades, is not small. And she wanted spousal maintenance on top of it, $3,200 a month, because, and I'll never forget her wording, "You were never really here anyway, Wallace. The kids barely know you. It's better this way." She said it kindly. That was the part that nearly finished me. She wasn't cruel about it. In her mind, she was doing me a favor, freeing me from a family that had, in her telling, never really been mine to begin with. And of course she was right, wasn't she? She knew exactly how right she was, in a way I wasn't supposed to know yet. I told her I needed to think. She said take all the time I needed. Then she smiled at me, that quick, warm smile that had knocked me down a flight of stairs in 1999, and she went to put the kettle on, and I sat there and understood that I was looking at the most gifted liar I would ever meet in my life. I hired a lawyer the next day. Gloria Reyes, a family law attorney downtown who came recommended by Ford. She was maybe 45, sharp as a fresh blade, and she had the useful habit of never once telling me what I wanted to hear. When I laid the whole thing out, the affair, the timeline, the paternity results, She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I've turned over in my head 100 times since. Mr. Merrick, I want to make sure you understand what these papers do and don't do, because I've watched men in your position blow themselves up chasing the wrong kind of revenge. She tapped the folder. In Washington, the affair itself won't move the needle much on the money. We're a no-fault state. A judge isn't going to punish her for cheating, not directly. But paternity is different. Paternity is a live legal question, and the timing of how we raise it is everything. If we say nothing, if we let a final divorce decree get entered establishing you as the legal father of all 3 children and ordering you to pay child support for all 3, then it's very hard, sometimes impossible, to undo. You'd be paying 18 years of support for 2 children who aren't yours, and a court may well hold you to it. So, what do? We don't ambush anybody on the courthouse steps like it's a movie, she said. That feels good for about 4 seconds, and then it costs you. What we do is we file properly before anything's final. We petition the court to establish parentage and order genetic testing. We put the man's name, Reed Vance, right there in the filing, and we time it so that she walks into what she thinks is a routine hearing, agrees to terms in front of the judge thinking she's already won, and then discovers that the ground under those terms is about to disappear. I asked her why we'd let her agree to terms at all if we were just going to blow them up. Reyes looked at me over her glasses. 2 reasons. First, because I wanted on the record, in her own words, exactly how much she was willing to take from a man she knew wasn't the father of 2 of those kids. Judges remember that. Second, and here she paused, and her voice got a little gentler than I'd heard it. Second, because you told me on the phone that you don't actually want to destroy those children. You want the truth on the table, and you want to stop being lied to. Those are different goals than she thinks you have, and that difference is your only real advantage. Don't waste in a stunt. She was right. About all of it. So we planned it out, and it went almost exactly the way she said it would. The morning of the hearing, my mother insisted on coming. She's 81 now, my mother, and she still has the ramrod posture of a woman who spent 40 years on her feet scrubbing floors, and she gripped my forearm in the hallway outside the courtroom, with hands that have gone thin and spotted but have never once in my life been weak. Wallace, she said, you fight for those babies. I don't care what that woman did. Those are your children, and you fight. She didn't know. I hadn't told her. I couldn't bear to be the one to take her grandchildren away from her, and so I let her believe I was about to lie down and let it all happen. That's the pity you saw in that room. That's why my mother made that small wet sound when I told the judge to give my wife everything. She thought she was watching her son surrender. Everyone in that room did. The judge, a woman named Reinhardt with reading glasses and the tired patience of someone who's watched 1,000 families come apart in that same room, went through the terms one at a time. Custody, the house, the support, the maintenance. And each time, she'd look at me and I'd say, no objection, Your Honor. My wife's attorney kept glancing at me like he was waiting for the trap, and when it didn't come, I watched him relax, and I watched my wife relax with him, and I watched that small smile come back to her mouth and settle in for good. Judge Reinhardt set the terms down and reached for a pen to sign the temporary order, and that's when Gloria Reyes stood up. Your Honor, before the court enters any order, the petitioner, that's my client, Mr. Merrick, has filed a motion I'd ask the court to take up now. It's a petition to establish parentage, along with a request for court-ordered genetic testing. We've served opposing counsel this morning. The room changed temperature. My wife's lawyer flipped through the papers he'd been handed at 8:30 and clearly hadn't read, and his face did something complicated. My wife turned to look at me for the first time all morning, and the smile was gone, and there was a question forming in her eyes that she was afraid to ask. And then Gloria Reyes did the one thing I'll remember on my deathbed. She walked slow and unhurried across the well of that courtroom to the respondent's table. She leaned down toward my wife until she was maybe a foot from her ear, and in a voice pitched low but not so low the court reporter couldn't catch it, she said 5 words. We already tested the children. That's it. 5 words. My mother told me later she didn't even hear them. She only saw the color leave my wife's face like water going out of a tub. Reyes straightened up and addressed the judge again, and she laid it out plain, that we had a preliminary genetic analysis, that we were requesting the court's own testing to make it official, and that the results of the private test indicated that 2 of the 3 children named in the custody and support request were not, in fact, the biological children of my client. She named Reed Vance. She entered the folder into the record. Judge Reinhardt set down her pen. She did not sign anything that day. She looked at me for a long moment, and I couldn't read what was in her face, and then she looked at my wife, and there was nothing gentle in it at all. She continued the matter, ordered the court's own genetic testing, and adjourned. I didn't gloat. I want you to know that. I sat there and I felt about 1,000 things, and not one of them was triumph. Mostly I felt tired in my bones, in a way I hadn't let myself feel in 4 months. The part that gives this story its name happened outside 20 minutes later. We'd all been ordered back for a follow-up, and there was paperwork to sign at the clerk's window, copies of the filed petition to take home. My wife came out of the courthouse ahead of me, onto that wide granite plaza on the front steps, and she was reading the copy of the petition as she walked, and I watched from the top of the steps as she got to the one sentence that did it. It's a dry sentence, legal language. It said, in effect, that the petitioner sought a judicial determination that he was not the biological father of the two elder children, and requested that the man named as the probable biological father be joined as a party to the proceeding. That sentence, that single dry, bureaucratic sentence with Reed Vance's name typed into it in 12-point font, is what finally made it real to her. Not my knowing, not the testing. The fact that it was now written down, filed with the county, part of the permanent record, impossible to smile away. She stopped walking, she read it again, and then her knees just went, right there on the courthouse steps, and she sat down hard on the cold granite with the papers in her lap, and she put her face in her hands, and for the first time in 22 years I saw my wife cry in a way that wasn't for an audience. I did not go to her. I want to be honest about that too. A better man might have. I stood at the top of the steps with my 81-year-old mother's arm through mine. My mother, who had just, in the span of 10 minutes, learned the whole terrible truth and was standing there in a state of shock I'll never forgive that woman for causing. And I watched, and then I walked my mother to the car. Here's what happened after, because the collapse is never the whole story. The consequences are. The court's own genetic testing confirmed everything. I was legally disestablished as the father of my two older children. That word, disestablished, is a strange, cold thing to have applied to 16 and 13 years of birthday parties and skinned knees and school plays. And I'll come back to it because it turned out to mean a lot less to my heart than it did to the law. The whole financial picture inverted. There was no basis for me to pay child support for two children who weren't mine, and Reed Vance, who, it emerged, had known full well those were likely his kids and had spent 16 years letting another man pay for them, found himself joined to the case and staring down back child support of his own. He'd been living the cheapest kind of life a man can live. All of the pleasure, none of the bill. That bill came due with interest. The maintenance she'd wanted, the $3,200 a month, evaporated. When the judge understood the full shape of what my wife had done, and that I'd genuinely spent 2 decades away from home, funding a household so she could carry on with a man across town, the sympathy that a court might otherwise extend to a long-married spouse with lower income simply wasn't there. She got a modest, short-term maintenance award to help her transition, and nothing more. She did keep the house, technically. But keeping the house meant buying out my equity, and buying out my equity meant taking on a mortgage she could barely carry on her own income, and the last I heard she'd listed it. There's a hard justice in that. She fought so fiercely to keep the walls, and the walls turned out to be the thing that broke her. Reed Vance's wife found out. I didn't tell her, I didn't have to. These things surface. He lost his marriage too, and the way I heard it, his own kids, the ones he'd been raising as the good and present father while my kids grew up with a stranger's face at the dinner table, stopped speaking to him for a while. Now, here's the part I actually want you to hear. Because if this were only a story about a man getting even, I don't think it would be worth 60 minutes of your evening. There was a night, a few weeks after the courthouse steps, when I was sitting alone in the one-bedroom apartment I'd rented near the river, and my 16-year-old, my son, and I will call him my son until the day I die, because a piece of paper with the word disestablished on it does not get to tell me who my son is, my son called me. His voice was shaking. He'd overheard enough, pieced enough together, and he asked me straight out, "Is it true you're not my real dad?" And I had a choice to make in that half second, the biggest one of my life. I could have told him the technical truth and let it fall on him like a beam coming loose. Or I could tell him the truth that was actually true. "Buddy," I said, "I was in that hospital when you were born. I taught you to ride a bike on Cannon Hill. I drove 11 hours through a snowstorm to make your 8th birthday. I have loved you every single day of your life without one day off. A test doesn't change any of that. It changes some legal paperwork and it changes nothing else. You're my son, you've always been my son. And I would very much like to keep being your dad if you'll let me," I cried. 2 men who aren't supposed to cry, crying into 2 phones on opposite sides of a city, and it was the best conversation I have ever had. It didn't fix everything overnight. My middle daughter took longer, she was angrier, and a lot of that anger got pointed at me for a while, which is fair, because I'm the one who blew the family up even if I didn't plant the bomb. My youngest, the one who's actually mine by blood, doesn't understand most of it and doesn't need to. To her, dad is dad. And slowly, over this past year, we've built something back. Not the thing we had, because that thing was made of lies and it deserved to come down. Something else. Something on solid footing for once. I have all 3 of them every other week now, and a lot of the summer. My son wants to study engineering, God help him. My middle girl and I are learning to fish badly on the Spokane River. My youngest still believes I hung the moon, and I'm in no hurry to correct her. Their mother sees them too, of course. I don't poison that well. Whatever she did to me, she's their mother, and my job isn't to win them away from her. It's to be a place where the truth lives so they always have somewhere to stand. And me, I'm all right. I stopped taking the long jobs. Turns out I don't need to be gone anymore. There was never really a good reason, only a story I told myself. I do local bridge inspection work now, home every night, and I've started spending Saturday mornings volunteering at a community woodshop downtown, teaching teenagers to build things that last. There's a woman there who runs the front desk, sharp and kind and about my age, and we've had coffee a few times, and I'm taking it slow, because I've learned the hard way what happens when you build fast on ground you haven't checked. My mother, bless her, has forgiven me for the courthouse. She said I should have told her, and she's right, and I told her so. She sees her grandbabies every Sunday. She says they're the only thing keeping her heart going, and I believe her. People ask me sometimes when they hear a piece of this whether I regret how I did it, whether the quiet and the waiting and letting her sit up there and take everything before we pulled the floor out, whether that was cruel. I've thought about it honestly, and no, I don't regret it. What I regret is the 20 years I spent believing that being a good father meant being far away earning money. What I regret is all the first steps and first words and ordinary Tuesday nights I traded for overtime, chasing a version of providing that let me skip the part where you actually have to be there. My wife lied to me for 2 decades, and that's on her. But I let myself be easy to lie to, and that part's on me, and I've made my peace with it by never being that man again. My oldest asked me the other day, out fishing, why I didn't just fight her for the house and the money right from the start, since I had the papers the whole time. I thought about it for a while, the line drifting in the current between us. I told him that the house was never the thing worth fighting for, that I'd spent my whole life confusing the walls with the home, the money with the love, the being there on paper with the being there. I told him that the day his mother sat down on those courthouse steps, I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd finally stopped losing. And I told him the truest thing I know, which is that a family isn't the thing you're handed by blood or by law. It's the thing you keep choosing every ordinary day, on purpose, out in the open, with nothing hidden in your pocket. He didn't say anything, but a little while later he reached over and knocked his shoulder against mine, the way he used to when he was small, and we sat there and watched the water go by, and I thought, there it is. That's the whole inheritance. Right there, that was enough for me. After everything, it turned out to be more than enough.